Jai Anilo Premadano Paramakacho
Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada ki. Discounted found the charge of Prabhupada ki. Koti Vaishnava ki. Now the charge of Haridas Thakur ki. Then you go host Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Harsi Bash Hariko Bhakta Vrinati Sisi Radha Krishna Gopinath Shyam Radha Kandagiri Govardhan ki Vrindavan Dham ki Mathura Dham ki Mayapur Bhagatit Dham ki Jamuna Mahi ki Sarvedesi ki Bhakti Devi ki Tulsi Devi ki Samaveda Bhakta Vrindaki, Sankirtan Yajnaki, all glories to the Son of the Lord, all glories to the Son of the Lord, all glories to the Son of the Lord. Go Premanand. This light is not working. Om Gyanananda Sadanjana Salakaya Chaksulamritam Jena Tasmai Sri Gurave Namaha Sri Chaitanya Manukastam Sthapitam Jena Bhutale Swayam Rupagadam Mayam Dadati Sakantantikam Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya 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 Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 1, Chapter 12, Text number 26. Rajarshinam Janayita Shasta Chokpata Gaminam Nigrahita Kaler Esha Bhuvo Dharmasya Kamana Rajarshinam Janayita Shasta Chukpatagaminam Nigranita Kaleresha Bhugo Dharmasya Karana Rajarshinam Janayita Shasta Chukpatagaminam Nigrahita Kaler Esha Bhuvam Dharmasya Karana
Rajarshinam Janayita Shastra Chukpatagaminam Nigrahita Kalesha Bhuvo Dharmasya Karana Rajarshinam Janayita Shastrakshotpatagaminam Nigrahita Kalesha Bhuvo Dharmasya Karana Rajarshinam Janayita Shasta Chokpatagaminam Nigrahita Kalesha Bhuvo Dharmasya Karana.
Ladies,
Rajarshinam Janayita Shasta Nigrahita Kalesha Bhuvo Dharmasya Karana.
Rajarshinam Janayita Shasta Chokpatagaminam Nigrahita Kalesha Bhuvo Dharmasya Karana.
Rajarishinam of kings as good as sages. Janayita, producer. Shasta, chastiser. Cha, and. Utpatagaminam of the upstarts, Nigrahita, molester, Kalehi of the quarrelsome, Eshaha, this, Bhuvaha of the world, Dharmasya of religion, Harana on account of. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. This child will be the father of kings who will be like sages. For world peace and for the sake of religion, he will be the chastiser of the upstarts and the quarrelsome. Purport. The wisest man in the world is a devotee of the Lord. The sages are called wise men, and there are different types of wise men to different branches of knowledge. Unless, therefore, the king or the head of the state is the wisest man, he cannot control all types of wise men in the state. In the line of royal succession in the family of Maharaj Yudhisthira, all the kings, without exception, were the wisest men of their times. And so also, it is foretold about Maharaj Parikshit and his son, Maharaj Janmejoy, who was yet to be born. Such were kings, such wise kings, can become chastisers of upstarts and uprooters of Kali, or quarrelsome elements. As will be clear in the chapters ahead, Maharaj Parikshit wanted to kill the personified Kali, who was attempting to kill a cow, the emblem of peace and religion. The symptoms of Kali are 1. Wine, 2. Women, 3. Gambling, and 4. Slaughterhouses. Wise rulers of all states should take lessons from Maharaj Parikshit in how to maintain peace and morality by subduing the upstarts and quarrelsome people who indulge in wine, illicit connection with women, gambling, and meat eating, supplied by regularly maintained slaughterhouses. In this stage of Kali, regular licenses issued for maintaining all of these different departments quarrel. So how can they expect peace and morality in the state? The state fathers, therefore, must follow the principles of becoming wiser by devotion to the Lord, by chastising the breaker of discipline, and by uprooting the symptoms of quarrel, as mentioned above. If we want blazing fire, we must use dry fuel. Blazing fire and moist fuel go ill together. Peace and morality can prosper only by the principles of Maharaj Parikshit and his followers. So the basis of good government is described here. Good government depends upon a proper, wise person. Because simply to have power without proper knowledge or intelligence can lead to so much mishap. Just like we see in history, that there were often powerful kings, but many times they were impious. In Vena Maharaj, in our Bhagavatam, is described as a very horrendous leader. And in the present age, we have people like Hitler and other such dictators that cause great pain to untold numbers of persons. It is certainly a result of one's past karma that one can be elevated to the position of leadership. But karma alone is not a guarantee of one's qualification. One has to be properly trained. We see that even examples in our own scriptures of great persons who were born in noble families, still they had to be properly trained. It wasn't enough to take birth from a father who was a Brahmin or a father who was a Vaishnava. One had to be trained in Brahminical culture, in Vaishnava way of life. So this training is all important, and the kings were given proper training in the Gurukul. The Gurukul was meant for training the kings, the Brahmins, and Vaishyas also received training. Only Shudras did not get or need to be trained. But all of those who were twice born by the proper process of initiation, they got trained by Guru. And the basis of that training was to worship the Supreme Personality of Godhead, because that is ultimately the essence of knowledge, to understand who we are, where we are coming from, and what is ultimately our goal in life. If a person doesn't have this knowledge, then it is described in the Bhagavatam that their knowledge is simply a burden, just like a turban, which is on the head of a person, is a heavy burden if that head is not bowed before the deity of the Lord. So similarly, anyone who has burdened with so much knowledge, if that knowledge is not used to serve and understand God, then what is the value of such knowledge? Prabhupada makes the point that even a PhD, which is the goal of academic learning, is nothing more than initials for indicating plow department, which also has PhD in it. In other words, people's academic achievements really don't entitle them to do much more than manual labor if those achievements or academic knowledge is not used to glorify God. And the same can be said for practically any skill or activity. And therefore, if a person, for example, is earning money, which it should be utilized in the service of God. Otherwise, their activities simply become uber karma, unwanted activity. So we have to learn the art of connecting everything with Krishna. And the leader of the world, or the leader of society, or the leader of state, or community, or a family, has only one real ultimate duty, and that is to lead his or her dependents on the path back to God. So, in this sense, we see how qualified was Maharaj Triksha, that when he came across a vicious person like Kali, he was fearless. He was prepared to kill him. Sometimes people misunderstand that our movement is a pacifistic movement. But we don't hold the idea that violence cannot be utilized under any circumstance. Violence has its proper use. Prabhupada gives the example. Proper use means guided with knowledge. He gives the example of a surgeon who uses cutting with a knife. He cuts the body of another person with a knife. And that is certainly violence. But that violence has an ultimate good for the person. Of course, this cannot and should not be abused, because someone may say, like Hitler, that I'm using violence for the good of the people. And of course, this brings in the question of what is morality, what is violence? Is it, right or wrong to kill someone under certain circumstances? These questions have always intrigued thinkers. Is there any ultimate principle on which morality can be based? Nowadays, sometimes people suggest that morality is relative to the particular situation and circumstance. For example, in one country, they burn the body of a dead person. In another country, they bury the body of a dead person. And still in another country, they eat the body of dead people. Now everybody went, like one point said, oh, how horrible. But they consider that to be a sign of ultimate respect, to eat your dead family members. In other words, your family members, this is a sign of respect. They would think that if you were to cremate the body of a deceased person, that's like the most disrespectful thing you could ever do. If someone is dear to you, you eat them. Just like sometimes a mother says to a child, I love you so much I could eat you. Now see it gets closer to home. So, and how will we determine what is, moral and what is not moral? In some societies, for example, they think that when a person dies, whatever body they have at the time of their death, that is the body that they will have in heaven. And so what they do is that by the time their parents reach the age of 30 or say at most 35, they chase them up into a tree, shake the tree, and cause the parents to come crashing down and die. With the idea that this way they're sending their parents to heaven with a young body of 30 or 35 years of age so that they can enjoy it. If they let their parents live any longer, and their parents live till they're 60 or 70, they're going to have to be destined to live in a 70-year-old body forever. So it's much more merciful to chase your father or mother up into a tree, shake the tree, and cause their early death. Now, you may judge that this is immoral, this is not proper. But if you have the philosophy that morality is simply relative to the particular culture, then you can't judge that way. You have to say, well, it's right for them, even if it's wrong for us. And similarly, whatever is going on in your own country, you have to accept as right. There's a problem with this philosophy, because if you say that whatever is the prevailing theory of a particular culture is what is moral, then that means that you have to accept whatever is within your own culture also. And some things within our own culture are not so acceptable. Just like, 150 years ago, there was slavery. And, people don't think that slavery was a very good thing. But if we accept cultural relativism, then we'd have to say it was a good thing because that's the way it was. And so you couldn't make any progress towards abolishing slavery. Women wouldn't have any votes. Slaves wouldn't have any freedom. And you can go on, naming all the things which have changed in America that wouldn't change if your philosophy is cultural relativism. So, on the other hand, there are some persons who think that there is such a thing as, morals which are universal. And they would argue that actually, if you look at it, whether you eat your dead relatives, bury your dead relatives, or cremate your dead relatives, the only thing that is different is the customs. But the actual value of caring for your relatives is the same. In other words, they would say that through all three of these examples, there is a common thread. And the common thread is, I care about my father and mother. How you show your care may be different, but the fact is that there is an element of care which is common to all. So persons who hold this view are called moral absolutists. They believe absolutely that there are some morals which do not change according to time, place, or circumstance. Not like, for example, they said that murder is not good. Of course, now the question would be how to determine what those absolute values are. And traditionally, one of the most dependable ways was to accept these statements of Scripture. This is, to make religion the basis for moral truths, to tie the two together, and very often that is the case. Of course, some detractors will argue that, well, I see some people act morally, and they don't believe in God. So whether or not you can say that God is the basis of morality, they can say, how can it be if some people don't believe in God still do? And then beyond that, they'd say that there must be something fundamentally wrong with murder, for example. And the fact that God says it's wrong doesn't make it wrong, it just proves that it is wrong. But what is it within the act itself which makes something immoral? If you just say it's because God says it's that way, that may only indicate that God agrees that this is a wrong act, a wrongful act. But what is it about the act which actually makes it immoral? If this question could be raised. Now, if you think about that, you might come to the conclusion that the simple general principle of morality would be that because I wouldn't want someone to do it to me, that's what makes it immoral. In other words, the most fundamental human sense of morality would be that whatever I would want for myself, I would give to or expect or allow for others to enjoy the same right. That's a general way of looking at morality without God. There's a problem with it, which is that I may have some perverse notion of what's good for me. In other words, I may think it's good for me to cut my arms every day with knives. So does that mean that I can go around and start cutting other people's arms with knives because I think it's good for me? One man's food is another man's poison. So you cannot judge morality based on something as relative as one's individual preferences. And similarly, the idea of cultural relativism is also not very acceptable because it doesn't allow you to make any judgment about anyone else's culture or your own culture. So it also has problems with it. So, when we evaluate everything we see, the thing which has basically directed human civilization, throughout history, has been the laws of religion, the laws of God. Just like this country, the sense of morality is based on the Bible, the Ten Commandments in the Old Testament, and the Sermon on the Mount. These are the things which everybody bases morality on. And of course, we have our Dharma Shastra, principles of morality which are espoused in different scriptures. The Bhagavatam makes it very clear. Dharma tu shakshat bhagavat pranita. Religion, Dharma, is enunciated by God. And we don't make a distinction between morality and Dharma, because the two are tied, they're interconnected. You cannot be immoral and be dharmic. You can't, for example, Prabhupada gives 4 simple principles of Dharma, of morality. No meat, fish, eggs, no gambling, no intoxication, and no illicit sex. And we would state that if you violate these 4, then the type of religion that you're following, or the type of moral life, is very questionable. How can someone claim to be moral, when they're slaughtering animals, killing cows, and saying he's a very moral person? And this is our problem that we find with certain people who are given, peace prizes, Nobel Peace Prizes, when we know that they're, cow killers, for example. And yet we wonder how can they get a peace prize. We know that they see human life as sacred, but they don't see life within any other form except human beings. In other words, they're ignorant. And yet they get some peace award. So, what we would have to say is that there may be some sense of morality, but because of the person's ignorance, they're not perfectly moral. And here it mentions that the king, who is the upholder of Dharma, Dharma Raj. Maharaj Yudhisthira is known as Dharma Raj. He's the upholder of Dharma. He's the upholder of morality. Dharma and morality are the same. He's the wisest person. In other words, without proper knowledge, without being wise, it's actually impossible to be moral. And this is the greatest problem that is, presently facing the world in terms of understanding morality. They're not wise. They don't have a system of knowledge which informs them about what is actually right or wrong. Maybe it's the best that they can do, that may be. Just like we may see some Aboriginal native, the best that they can do, is what we see in them, living out in the wilds, unclothed, scrounging around for grubs, killing anything in sight and eating it. Now, that's not civilization. That's not society. And if it is, it's the most basic and beginning stages of society. Or you could say the end stages. The beginning stages seems to imply that we agree with evolution, but we don't. We have to say this is the last sign of society before you devolve into the animal species, that Aboriginal life. But actually, Aboriginals probably aren't nearly as bad as the so-called civilized people who live in these cities, whose activities are far more immoral, far worse than the Aboriginal can commit. Because with all of the wealth and power at their disposal, and being fairly intelligent, but being very impious, they misuse their intelligence, just like it's described. They don't know who God is. They're mudhas. And they're maya gandis. And they're asuras. Their misdirected intelligence leads them to misuse the power that they have to commit abominable activities. Bhagavad Gita says, men that destroy the world. Aboriginals can't destroy the world. They can just kill off a few grubs. Aboriginals don't make nuclear bombs and drop them on hundreds of thousands of people. So who's the more immoral person? Who's the more uncivilized person? A tribes person living on the plains of central Australia, eating grubs, or some sophisticated scientist who creates an atomic bomb or nuclear weapon and drops it and kills millions of people. Who's the Aboriginal and who's the civilized person? Probably neither are civilized and both are Aboriginal. The only type of civilized person is called Aryan. In the Bhagavad Gita we find this word Aryan. And it means one who is progressive in spiritual life is called an Aryan. Now, of course, the Germans, who had a fascination with Vedas, they borrowed different things from Vedic culture, just like the word Aryan. And they took it to mean Aryan means a superior race. And superior race means Germans. That's how they understood. Ethnic cleansing. They killed off millions of Jews with the idea that, now we will have an Aryan race. That's not exactly what the Vedas taught us, though. The Vedas are not referring to some physical designation like, nationality. It's referring to one who understands that they're not their body. One who understands the nature of the soul is to progress back to home, back to Godhead. That is an Aryan. Now, unless a leader has this knowledge, then we have to say that what they're directing is the people to go not to back home, but to hell. And hell is no nice home to live in. Even this particular planet, now as it is not a very nice place to live, but it's a lot worse than hell. If you read the descriptions from the 5th canto of the Bhagavatam, no one wants to go, no one would call that place home. I mean, I don't find it anywhere in the Bhagavatam where it says that those who are being punished in hell consider it home. Although they do become, accustomed to the suffering, so much so that eventually they're prepared for the next body. This is how you get your next birth. If you're impious, you're taken to hell, and you are punished again and again, until eventually the punishment becomes habitual. You become accustomed to it. And you get ready for your next birth. Just like if if you had to go on eating flesh, tearing flesh from someone's bones, then gradually you're getting prepared to become a tiger. And so there's a punishment in hell where you have your flesh torn from you again and again by ravenous dogs. And you tear the flesh with your teeth of other people. You sit around eating each other. Sounds gruesome, but that's the punishment that is there. And eventually, you develop a taste for this flesh eating. Then you can become a carnivorous animal. This is how you get prepared. So, it's just astonishing how people sit in these restaurants all over the world, how they sit at home, and they do this very act, tearing and chewing flesh. And we know which type of birth they're preparing for themselves in the next life. This is karma. But they don't know, because they're ignorant. There is a tremendous responsibility which rests upon anyone who has knowledge. As you can see, Parikshit Maharaj is mentioned here, and he will not simply bear this knowledge on his head like a heavy burden. He's going to use this knowledge. He's going to give protection to the people. Now, we're not in the position of administration where we can tell and direct and control what people do. Therefore, we have to act as brahmins and distribute this knowledge. This is the way we can relieve ourselves of the burden. If you don't use it, you'll lose it. If you don't use this knowledge, you're going to lose it. If you don't preach it, you won't understand it. There's a statement which says that unless you can teach something, you don't ultimately understand it. And if you teach something 10 times, it becomes yours forever. Now, I'm sure that you have heard many instructions, many times, but you may not have used it 10 times. And therefore, you may not be fully convinced. Or you may say, no, I am. Well, we don't know. Sometimes people are put under a test, and when the test gets difficult enough, they collapse. They're not strong enough. So, to become strengthened means to utilize transcendental knowledge. Strength, knowledge is strength. Wisdom is strength. Not simply, brute force. That's not strength. Just like, the tiger, the story, the tiger was chasing, I think it was a fox or something. And the fox told the tiger eventually, I think, a lion, it's easy to, if you really want to, it's easy to fight with me, I'm no match for you. Just trying to figure out how to save your skin. So if you really want to see, a powerful opponent, there's one right down inside here. And he pointed to a well. He said, you go ahead and roar down there and you'll hear how loud this roars. So the lion roared, and of course out of the well came his own echo. And he thought, oh, now I've really met someone who's worthy of being my foe. And he jumped right into the well to fight that foe, and of course he lost his life. And here was a lion that was so powerful, but he was defeated by the cunning intelligence of a fox. So, intelligence is more powerful than brute force. It's not And although, the present meat-eating civilization may be very brutish and powerful, but they're not intelligent. They do not know what the goal of life is. They lack even the most simple intelligence or knowledge that a common villager has in a place like India, where from the very beginning of life, one knows one is not one's body, one does believe in God. So, all of this is only to say that, as Prabhupada gives the point at the end, blazing fire and moist fuel go ill together. Peace and morality can prosper only by the principles of Maharaj Krishna and his followers. The world is hankering after peace, but they can't get the formula right. Because they want to be peaceful while acting immorally. That's not possible. If there's going to be peace in the world, if there's going to be peace in your own life, there has to be morality. A person who is very moral, we equate morality with Krishna consciousness. Anyone who is Krishna conscious will be peaceful. And if you lack peace of mind, if you're disturbed mentally, it means you're not practicing Krishna consciousness properly. Because if you chant nicely, you read and hear nicely, you worship the deity, you associate with the devotees, you do devotional service, you do some preaching work, you will be peaceful. You'll be moral. And your example will be the best instruction that you can give others. Because if someone doesn't act properly, their words have no effect. So we have to learn to behave in an ideal way. And it's not that difficult. I mean, we're not being asked, to do some type of difficult tapasya, stand on one leg for 25 years with your arms stretched up in the air. Nobody's been asked to do that. All you have to do is get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and somehow get into the temple by 4:30, and then chant 16 rounds and follow 4 principles. That's all you've been asked to do. It's not that difficult. If that's all you have to do, and gradually you become elevated, and one day be able to go back to Godhead, I think it's a small price to pay. Very not super difficult austerity. It must be difficult, of course, because how many people are doing it? How few people in the city of Dallas, out of Dallas, Fort Worth, there must be at least 2 million people, 1.5 to 2 million people. There's hardly anyone who can do it. You can go to a gym and work out muscle building for 5 hours a day. You can go to work 8 to 10 hours a day, 5 days a week. They can do incredible austerities. But when you ask them to simply get up at 4, come to Mangal Arati and chant 16 rounds and follow these 4 principles, it's practically like telling them, they'd rather choose death. It's so difficult. Anyway, it's not so difficult for those of us who are here now. We've understood that we can do it. But even for us, it sometimes becomes a chore. Well, it may be, but some things have to be done. Duty calls. But then hopefully the duty should turn into actual, loving service. In other words, it's to remain on the platform simply of a chore, of duty, is not so pleasing to Krishna. We should come to the point where Krishna is, being worshipped by through our service with love, not simply out of a sense of fear that if I don't do this, I may not go back to Godhead. That's not the highest principle of serving Krishna. Eventually, we should serve Krishna with love. And our love will be invoked through the process of bhakti. The natural way of invoking love is through the process of bhakti. Shravanam Kirtanam, to hear and chant the glories of Krishna, to see the attractive forms of the deities. Shravanam Kirtanam Vishnu Smananam Padasevanam Vandanam Bhajam Dasam Sakyam Akranideva. The ninefold process of devotional service, that will increase our bhakti more and more. Any one of those that you perform in a regular way, any combination of them will gradually produce bhakti. And one who is a devotee of the Lord has all the good qualities of the demigods, is the most moral person. So let us advance in the path as exemplified by great personalities like Maharaj Krishna. Are there any questions? Yes, Narada.
In discussing morality and karma, a couple of questions came up to me that weren't clear. One was, generally when we talk about butchering animals or killing animals, we understand for severe reactions. But the question was brought up that if an animal is butchered, say if a person pays the butcher for the bones or for the meat, and feeds that to a dog or to an animal, there's no karma for that because that's the natural food of that animal.
Yes, so the real problem is why keep a dog? In other words, if you argue that a dog has the right to eat meat, so if you purchase the meat for the dog, you don't get any karma, but then why do you have a dog? Alright, so let's suppose, first of all, let us suppose there are problems with this argument, because an animal that has the ability to eat flesh also has the ability to kill it. So dogs were originally wolves. And they ran wild, and they had the ability to kill their own flesh, and they got no karma. You have no business keeping a wolf as a pet. And if you do, then you have to get the karma of killing the animal. You have no ability to kill an animal with your raw hands. Go ahead and do it. Dogs can kill. At least they used to be able to. Now they probably can't. They're domesticated. They're all become entangled in a terrible cycle of karmic activity. Dogs have become more like humans, and humans have become more like dogs. It's getting closer. Because humans can kill for their flesh that they need to eat. They said they need to eat. And dogs can't get it. So dogs have changed. Yes, Roger.
Actually, they sell vegetarian dog food and they say it's nutritionally complete, so there really is no need to feed dogs meat.
That's why Yoga Mind has a pet dog. Is yours dog a vegetarian, Yoga Mind? She's acting as, she's, showing mercy to another living entity. Shivananda Singh also kept the dog. And Lord Chaitanya even showed affection to that dog by feeding it coconut pulp. And the dog went back to God. Yes?
Another question came up in a similar fashion that, say for example, if someone works at McDonald's and they're serving hamburgers. Now, if they say become a devotee and they give money to the temple, there shouldn't be any karma in that.
Would you go and offer arati with your hands dripping with blood?
But then on the other hand...
No, but first we'll answer.
Of course not, of course not.
Of course not. So, similarly, how can someone come and make an offering on the altar, bringing money, in other words, to the Purnami box, with their hands covered with blood? Is that the kind of offering that God likes? That money was earned by slaughtering cows. Then you take that money and offer it to Krishna and say, see Krishna, I'm giving you so much money. Do you think Krishna is such a fool? He's going to accept that money? Krishna only can see the money, the green. He doesn't see what's behind it. He doesn't see the red.
The second part of the question is that sometimes we're working for companies or we're doing different activities. For example, say we're doing land surveying and we're building McDonald's or we're building up different types of institutions.
Yeah, there's karma for that. But it's not as bad as directed. The closer you get to the sinful act, the heavier the karma is. But as Prabhupada says, in this day and age, it's impossible to do almost anything in this world without incurring some sin. Therefore, you have to give part of your earning to the deity to purify it. And you have to chant Hare Krishna. You have to do all of these things to neutralize the sinful effects which come from almost any act that you can do in this world. Everything. And there's sin in everything. You're going around a car. The car's going on petrol. The petrol is drawn out of the earth, which Prabhupada says is improper. I mean, you just can't. Who made your car? You look at what a car is. The parts of it. It goes on and on and on and on. The paper where, you buy products, they're in paper bags. Trees were cut down. It goes on and on. In the Vedic culture, we don't hear about cutting down trees to make paper. That's unheard of. You don't cut a tree down to make paper. Unless, of course, the paper is used for printing Bhagavad Gita and other valuable literatures. Then at least that tree becomes advanced spiritually by sacrificing its body in the service of God. Yeah? Yes?
Chanakya Pandita said a man who is wise is one who sees every other's property as mud and every woman as his mother and everybody is more important than himself. But he doesn't seem to mention that one has to be devotee because
yeah, but how do you get to do all those things unless you're a devotee? If you're not a devotee, how do you see everybody's property as mud? How do you see every other woman as your mother? And how do you see yourself as the lowest? Unless one is a devotee of the Lord, how do you develop that vision? It's only Krishna consciousness that gives you the strength to have that vision. Without Krishna consciousness, it doesn't matter what you're good. Look at Ravana. Ravana had so many good qualities. Ravana was very intelligent. Where do you think he got his gold from? Prabhupada said he got his gold from Brazil. He built a tunnel underneath the ocean and pulled out the gold out of South America to make his golden city in Lanka. And that takes a lot of intelligence. And everybody knows he was a big follower of the Vedas, but he was not a devotee of the Lord. Therefore, he's considered the most sinful, immoral person. Without Krishna consciousness, there's no question of morality. Whatever morality there is simply appearance. It's not actual. So whatever Chanakya Pandita says about someone being moral, the underlying factor is religiousness. You may appear to be moral for a certain amount of time, but without genuine Krishna consciousness, your morality will gradually be seen to be simply a facade. Sooner or later, it will collapse. Yeah, sure.
Can you speak about maybe someone who might come to devotion first and then go back to engaging in such activities of working those workplaces and engaging in that kind of activity?
Obviously, for a person who knows better, the punishment when they do a wrong is worse than if they hadn't known. If someone is a devotee then falls down and commits sinful activities, there is more severe punishment than if they had not been a devotee. That's why some people say, I'm not going to chant Hare Krishna. Because now I don't know any better. So when I do my nonsense, it's not so bad for me. But if I start becoming Krishna conscious, and then I want to do nonsense again, I'm going to have to suffer twice as much. Of course, that's not a very good argument. But that's a fact. A second offense is considered worse than the first offense in a court of law. It's punished more severely. Of course, in the case of the devotee who's fallen and commits an offense, let us understand that he's saintly if he's rightly situated. If he's actually a devotee, then he will get punished more severely, but the punishment will have a different effect. The punishment will purify him. Punishment can do different things. Punishment can be the beginning of descent or ascent. It can send you down to hell. Sometimes we see criminals become embittered and get worse by getting punished. But when a devotee gets punished, he immediately understands, I'm suffering because of what I've done. As soon as a devotee suffers any mishap, he immediately thinks, I'm actually sinful, and this is a reaction for all of my sins. But karma doesn't think that. The devotee gets purified by suffering. The karma gets nothing but trouble from suffering.
Someone might question that for an ordinary person, there seems to be no real benefit in being sent to hell and suffering because he has no recollection of why he's there.
Recollection is one way of benefit, but there are different types of, benefits. Just like I may not know much about my father, but he may have left me $1 million. Doesn't mean I can't get the benefit of $1 million. In other words, remembrance is only one way of learning or benefit. So what may happen in heaven or hell or wherever, you may not know about all the past things, but your position according to the result of what happened to you. That's my point. Whether I know my father or not, if he left me $1 million in the will, I get the money. Know it or don't know it. You get the money. So whether you understand your past karma or not is irrelevant in terms of what you will get as a result. Knowledge of past karma is not required to get the result of past karma. Krishna knows. Krishna remembers. And when and if you require, he'll remind you. And to some degree you can know by studying. The Bhagavatam says if you're intelligent, you can study the present carefully and understand the past as well as the future. So even if you can't remember, just by the symptoms of your present existence, you can understand something of the past and of the future. Yes?
The leaders of the religion do not tell the people who are following the religion what's good and what's bad. Whose responsibility is it? Is it the responsibility of the leaders, or is it the responsibility of followers?
It's the responsibility of the leaders to lead, but it's also the responsibility of the followers if the leaders are not qualified to become leaders themselves. So, in one sense, it's everybody's responsibility to become educated. If you don't have the opportunity to get a good education, then educate yourself. You gain nothing by blaming someone else for failing to do their duty for you. Just like if no one feeds you, doesn't mean you starve. Or do you go out and find some food to eat? I think if, one may be accustomed, a man might be accustomed to his wife feeding him, but after a while she stops serving dinner, what would he do? Is he going to sit there and die from starvation? He'll go out and eat somewhere and he'll get food himself and cook. So similarly, you can wait for your leaders to educate you, but if you find that they're not educating us, unless you like ignorance, you'll learn yourself. We're putting these books in everybody's hands. You can force a horse to the water, but you can't force a horse to drink. That's the same. You can lead a horse to the water, but you can't make him drink. So we can stick these books in everybody's hands. You can't force people to read. How can you force them? Even if you tie their hands and force open their eyes, they can just blank out in their minds. So there has to be some will on the individual's part to take responsibility for himself or herself. There has to be some individual effort made. You can't just say, I am just a receptacle, and the teachers should pour knowledge into me. It's a two-way street. You've got to, Tattvanipari Krishna Seva. It says you're supposed to find out a guru and inquire. It doesn't just say find out a guru and he'll teach you. It says you have to find out a guru, you have to inquire, and you have to do service. It's a two-way street. If it doesn't go both ways, it won't go. A good teacher is inspired by a good student as much as the student is inspired by the teacher. So there's just as much responsibility on the person who's studying as there is on the person's teaching. Both of them are responsible. All right, time is up. Thank you very much. Today's Ekadasi. Take advantage, chant, and hear and remember the glories of Krishna more and more today. Srila Prabhupada ki, Gaur Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada ki, Gaur Premanand ki.